Welcome back to Bazooka Kickboxing and MMA. Today's episode, powered by HAYABUSA, is all about transitioning from your boxing stance into your kickboxing stance. In today's episode, we're going to talk about an important aspect when it comes to fighting, and that is transitioning between stances. Too many times we learn one stance and think that is the only stance we have to be in. But when it comes to our striking, the two most important stance we always talk about would be one, your boxing stance and your kickboxing stance. So first, let's talk about the difference between the two. In your boxing stance, this is where you learn the basics and the traditional way of usually throwing punches, right? So you get in a good stance and you learn to turn your hips, your shoulders, and your pivots, which is important in kickboxing, just as important as it is in boxing. You have to be able to pivot your feet, turn your hips, rotate your core, all to generate as much power. And a good boxing stance allows for that. But what does a kickboxing stance do that a boxing stance doesn't? It's the longer stance. By being in a longer stance, it lets me load up my rear kick a lot more or my rear knee, which lets me get more power. If I have to throw a power kick from a boxing stance, the short stance is gonna require me to kind of throw my kick with more energy without relaxing and letting the kick unfold, which is what you want when you wanna throw a lot of kicks. You wanna stay relaxed and generate as much power as you can with as little effort as possible. So you need to understand that transitioning between the two and doing so quickly is a skill in itself. And this is where we're gonna get into the details of the video. Yes, it's important to get into both, but how can you use both smoothly? How to use both effectively? So the first thing you need to talk about when you have the stances is defensively. What happens in the different stances? Now, when I'm in a boxing stance, you'll notice that you tend to be more bladed, which means sideways, and my front foot is pointed out, which my heel is out, which means it's harder to hit me down the center line. But what happens there now is I'm opening myself to getting hit by the calf and the low kick, and it's harder for me to defend kicks in general. Plus, by having my lead foot this way, it takes so much more effort to throw my right kick because now I have to pivot so far on the other side. It's too slow, and at the highest level, all of those things make a big difference, okay? So when I'm in my kickboxing stance, I'll be a little bit more square. So boxing stance, I'll be a little bit more square in my kickboxing. But now, when I want to attack, by having that long stance, I'm able to push, drive, generate power, and get that long stance. But me having that front foot pointing forward, it lets me check off and block a little bit easier. In kickboxing, we have to understand we have our defensive stance and our offensive stance. Regardless, the defensive stance in kickboxing, I gotta be able to lift my legs, right? In boxing, we don't have to worry about being kicked at the leg, so we can stay bladed. So the 50-50 defensive stance is important to block low kicks, and then when I attack, I step. Okay, so now you should have a quick understanding of the three different stances you'll utilize a lot when it comes to mixed martial arts or kickboxing. So quick recap, your boxing stance, traditional boxing, all power, good pivots, a little bit shorter, right? Then you have your kickboxing stance, which is split into two. We have our defensive stance, which allows us to use leg blocks and blocks, right? We gotta lift our legs up. And two, our offensive stance, which is a longer stance, which lets us use our power kicks. Okay, so now we have an understanding of the kick. How do we get in between the two? Now, the quickest way, which I like to use, is just understanding the stepping. If my opponent isn't attacking my legs, I'm going to use more of a boxing stance to be able to generate as much power as I can. The boxing stance allows me to punch with more power because I could rotate my rear hip a little bit more. The longer stance takes away the little hip drive and the weight being forward. But if I'm long, you can see here, it's harder for me to kick. But when my head is forward, it's more aggression, which means more weight transfer, which means more power. So the way we would use this and to transition quickly is I would use a more of a shorter boxing stance on the inside. As soon as I feel my opponent exit, I go into a long stance, which allows me to kick at that point. So what I'm really doing is boxing here on my opponent's exit. I step to lengthen my stance, and then I launch my kick. So power stance, they exit, I lengthen my stance, now I'm long, and now I can kick on their exit. So box, as soon as they go to exit, I lengthen, keeping my back foot in the ground, and then next thing you know, I have the launch. So that's the quick. On their exit, I'm going to make sure I'm able to go and I can step. Now, it's all about closing that distance and stepping. So you just have to make sure you practice the basics of both. Being able to step and walk at the same time. Jab, cross, and be able to move across the ground by stepping. But remember, when you want to really drive that rear kick, you need that long stance. So I'll give you a quick example. If I'm gonna do jab, cross in a boxing stance, 1, 2, 1, 2. You see my feet are traveling with me. Now, when I wanna transition from the boxing stance, 1, 2, 1, I'm in a long kickboxing stance, and then the 2 turns into a kick. So walking and stepping to punch, and then when I know I want to kick, I transition to the long stance while I'm walking. So it's seamless, and you don't know when I'm going to punch or when I'm going to kick, but it naturally happens in my footwork. Now, the one thing I like to use a lot more of, and you've seen in my fight, is because I'm an aggressive fighter, I like to use push-off attacks. I like to come inside and box on the inside and use my low kicks. I'm a combination style fighter. Right? Punch, 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 usually 2, 3, 4 punch, go to the leg, head, leg. And there's a lot of volume going up and down on the legs. But when I'm fighting someone who doesn't want to move backwards, it takes away my kicks, right? Because ultimately I'm a kickboxer and I utilize my kicks a lot more than most fighters do. So instead of sitting there and boxing in the mid-range, I want to give them my ultimate weapon, which is my low kick. So what I do is I create the push-off attack. Right? So I'm in boxing stance. As I push off or I create that space, I've lengthened my stance. So by pushing them off, my back foot's still grounded, and now I have a good solid drive off their exit, right? So I've created that type of stance switch, right? Inside boxing, they go to exit, long stance, boom. I got that big power home run style kick that I'm looking for, right? So that's that transition. Inside boxing, push off lengthens my stance. Now I'm in a power kickboxing offensive stance. Now, the last one I'm going to talk about, and I don't talk about this much on the channel, so this is a little bit newer for people, but I call it the kickstand. And the kickstand, it's similar to a draw attack where I'm pulling my back leg behind me. By drawing, so if I'm here and I'm pulling backwards, that is what I call my kickstand. So right now, because we know the language, I'm gonna say I'm in a defensive kickboxing stance. So I'm able to block, right? My legs are coming up, boom, I can block kicks. Now, instead of pushing forward to lengthen my stance, I'm going to step backwards. So you can see if I'm in center line, right? If I'm in a boxing stance, 50-50, or a Muay Thai style block stance, right? Defense. I'm gonna transition to a kickboxing stance on their exit, or I come back. Or if they come pressure me, I back step with my back foot, and by stepping back, I lengthen my stance. So I'm lengthening my stance by going backwards or forward, right? So defensive stance, forward attack, come back. They come back, kickboxing long stance by stepping back. So no matter what, I created that lengthened stance from my boxing stance by using my steps or my push-offs or different attacks. So being able to transition between boxing and kickboxing footwork is very important. Yes, it gets a little bit more complicated when you add in side stances, but this should give you the basic idea of how to use the different stances. But the key is transition between them seamlessly. It is too frustrating to see people either just box or just kick. And ultimately we see a single kick or punch combinations, right? The key, the artistry of the sport of mixed martial arts is blending the styles together. Let's put our kicks, punches, knees, jump knees, all these different attacks together in one. I want to see the flowing of your punches and kicks seamlessly. Kick, punch, kick. Put these together, put the momentum, get the flow going, and it's just gonna make you that much more effective, manage distance better, and in that distance you're gonna be able to generate more power because you're learning to lengthen your stance from going forward or going backwards or creating different types of distance control to get you there. Okay, so make sure you keep liking, subscribing, hit the notification bell, and make sure you check out HAYABUSAfight.com and their T3 boxing glove line. Make sure you go to Perfect Sports, get 20% off using code Bazooka20 Both links are in the description below. Finally, if you like the merchandise I'm wearing, head over to bazookashop.com and pick up these tank tops and some of our team gear. So we'll see you next time here at Bazooka Kickboxing and MMA.